This is Duke University.
Let's go into the final session. Erda and I had thought that it would be really interesting to have a closing session where the chairs of the panels, who, as Ara so nicely put it, in a very decentralized way, put together these various different panels. And I think it's a model to be followed, because chairs then become really engaged with the panel. And I think we were really lucky in the ways that there were overlaps between panels. So just as a brief introduction to this final session, I would say that what we've had is both the bird's and the worm's eye views. So we've had the museums from the top and the biennales, the Hiltons, and then we've had the hubs for the production of garbage. And I'm thinking also what happened in Beirut after the Civil War technically ended in 1990. So the debris from the destroyed part of the downtown was then collected and became part of the reclaimed land on which new buildings have been built. We've cut across disciplines. We've gone from film to anthro to art history, architecture. We've had practitioners and academics and some who are both. And very interestingly, I think what has happened in terms of area has been really, really interesting. So we have Ashaima and Ankara on the same panel, but coming together as the speakers recognized. So we've covered countries in Africa, and we've covered countries in Asia, Latin America. We touched briefly, and maybe not quite as excitingly, on Europe, but we totally left out America. So, you know, no New York, no San Francisco, no LA.
Durham. Not even
And yeah, Durham actually might have fitted better. So I'm excited to have been through this whole conference and to hear what our chairs have to say. Miguel.
I will invite Professor Nasser. Professor, will you?
No, I've asked him.
I thought I sent you so that we can have a discussion since we lost.
I mean, the idea is that this is a conversation for
Yeah, but we're all,
right?
Miguel, we're all talking.
Opposite sides of the table.
Yeah, he wanted to do it from there.
Exactly. Something that I've been thinking is that, okay, and it's because it's my interest in the past few years, is that cities are still places in like bodies, right? That we have to build, and they grow, and they transform, they decay, they have all this fluids coming through it, have to inputs and outputs, and the waste thing, and that they have to, that we have to think about them more like organisms than like fixed structures. And sometimes because of the ways we look at, or the ways history just pushes here through issues of reason and logics and modernity, let's say, bring this issue of as a very kind of laid down kind of planning purposes, and sometimes we find that that's not enough. That we have to treat this man-made space, the second nature, as that, right? Something that is just in constant flux and change. That actually relates to each other, right? It has neighbors and has siblings and cousins and things, and sometimes Bill gets into trouble with the family, and the father just dies, and then somebody else grows up and things like that. And I always think about these utopian projects, and just I'm referring to this fascinating issues of eco-cities in China, how they work, and this utopian spaces that were built in some parts of the world in the mid-70s that are still around, like these experimental communities that could be addressing very interesting issues of human survival. Which we are, I mean, cities are still pushing a lot of what is going on in terms of our bad outputs to the environment. And it's precisely that, is that if a city, if we think of cities more as organisms that are connected to a larger ecologies, then we could start addressing other issues beyond the issue of aesthetics, the arts, you know, the capital, the financing, the infrastructure, but to think about a city as part of a larger real, not network of global cities, but a network of life spaces that have to sustain and have to somehow help sustain this planet in which we are. And that's one of my interests. I always think about Brasilia, for example, a very utopian, modernist kind of enclave in the middle of the Amazon in the mid-20th century, you know, as the space of modern, I mean, it's modernity at its best, right? It's reason right? It's modernism in the middle of the jungle, but a city that was not really inhabited by people, but through the decades, right? You go now and it's a city that has a beautiful modernist core, but every single part has been, you know, also transformed organically by people crossing it. And around the city is a bunch of slums, right? That makes it live, right? And that's precisely what it is. I mean, it's just another organism in which us, you know, parasites live in, right? And it's just to think about that. What's next? With the global city has to be, you know, basically a large family in which we have to somehow relate to each other and try to keep sustaining. And I like the viruses, right? I like this, you know, hiccups and, you know, people mobilizing in the center of the city. You know, it's like a heart attack. And the city sometimes halt, and then something has to happen, right? Has to exercise, right? And I think we should think on those terms.
Well, I think about it a little bit differently. Because I come from novel studies, and this conference has been just a wonderful experience for me. I realized, you know, that virtually every one of the novels that I care about, and I think is going to, well, let me just say, I think something amazing is happening right now in the history of the novel, that we will look back and say, before this date, the novel dealt in a certain kind of realism. After this date, it's another kind of virtual realism. Something has happened. Something is happening at this moment in time from which the novel is not going to recover, and I mean that in a very good way, okay? That it's becoming something else. It's more mutable than an organism for me. The global city is either there in each one of these texts, and this extends throughout the Anglophone world, but also to some degree in the Francophone world, where these principles obtain. Global city is either there, as in Lauren Bucas's Zoo City, where Joburg has become a sort of prison camp, but part of a network with New Orleans and a bunch of other cities that have served as sort of prison camps in the past. And the satellite cities that we've been talking about have become sort of that's where the normal people live. In Coetzee's novel, where Michael K., Nobel Prize winning novel, Michael K., his protagonist, wanders across a landscape that's both barren and also, in a sense, occupied, even though you can't spot a military officer everywhere. So there is no longer that sort of Raymond Williams contrast between country and city. All land is extractable, and available for appropriation and being made into this old world. But I think at the same time as these novels stress, all this land is also, the people who inhabit the ground are appropriating this debris of surplus capital. And there's this furious creativity going on at the same time. So you have a sort of dual network structure where you have these sort of devastated cities or barren landscapes linking up to one another. These are all the pockets of a global neoliberalism that have not yet been exploited, that aren't really on its map. You have two networks that are not the same, but which are interacting. I mean, this is the way these novels are disorganizing the novels of the past and producing the form of the future, it seems to me. And this is true whether we're talking about the African landscape, as in Bucas and Coetzee, or post-war Europe in W.G. Sebald. I mean, even though it's been rebuilt, all Sebald's protagonists see the rubble that it has been made of and the communities that have been therefore obfuscated. And they trace through the rubble to find their own lost history. The same with the landscape of East Asia, transformed by the Bhopal disaster. This is in Animals, People, an Indra Sina novel. And the New York City, this is one of my favorite novels. New York City becomes one of these global cities after a plague which renders most of humanity alive, but not alive as individuals. They're zombies, but they have this capacity for self-organization and collective intelligence. And New York has become this, it's called Zone 1, and the object is to clear it free of zombie life so normals can come back into being. And of course, normals don't realize that they're actually in a prison camp. My point is, I want to make, I was talking to Nazar about it last night, that so many of the spaces that you all have been talking about have this character of reversibility, where they're, on the one hand, they work as an encampment, perhaps, as in Tahrir Square, but that encampment can at any moment reverse and become a prison camp. Tactics can turn into the other guy's. One person's tactics can become the other guy's strategy. So walls are put around it, and these people are suddenly reclassified as criminals or of this kind or that kind. And all the university people go into the houses around the edge. I love that. I think this is true of the local and global. I wanted to say something about that because in my books, this is always an issue in the classroom. How much of a part are the local circumstances in South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa? How much of a role are those playing? And to what degree does it matter whether this is in South Africa or not? Because the Coetzee is clearly aware of the fact that this same phenomenon is occurring in various sites throughout the world. It seems to me that, okay, this is what I use to explain it in the classroom, and I'll just throw it out to see if any of you find it helpful. There's a little essay on the paradigm by Giorgio Agamben, who I think is overrated and steals most of his good stuff from Foucault. And this is one of the things he steals from Foucault. It's the notion, he takes the notion of a paradigm from Foucault's Panopticon, which was originally a very concrete plan by Jeremy Bentham for a reformed penal institution, and becomes, in Foucault's history of liberal society, the model for institutions as such. However, the plan doesn't exist in a metaphorical relationship or as figure to ground, in a metaphorical relationship to the particular. Foucault says, or Agamben makes Foucault say, that we recognize the panoptical structure of the modern classroom, the hospital, the loony bin, we see there's a moment when the architecture exposes itself and we say, aha, this may be a university I've never been to, but it doesn't matter, I know where to go. This is a space I recognize. This is how Agamben describes the paradigm. And what's interesting to me is in giving up that metaphorical hierarchy of a plan or pattern that then has particular manifestations, which can be understood in terms of a plan. The paradigm works metonymically. It spreads like a disease, okay, or virally. Okay, so we go to new places and we recognize at one and the same time the sort of abstract plan, but we see it embodied or embedded in particular architecture and flows of life. Okay, so we see the two together, and he argues, I think correctly, that the two are unintelligible when they are separate from each other. And that was sort of what I took away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I just wanted to thank all of the presenters who are still here and our keynote speaker, because it has been enormously stimulating. And I guess I just wanted to pull back a little bit and think about the city in terms of structural relationships, because it seemed to me that there were two things that really came out, at least particularly of our panel on curation, which is what is being done in the city and then what is being done to the city. Mm-hmm. And that kind of relationship, the city as space and the city as something that in which you enact things or have interventions, ephemeral or permanent, and then the ways in which the city as an entity unto itself needs to be redetermined, rethought. And then I saw other kind of sub-themes emerging here, which is the city as stage or frame to enclose or perform identities and narratives, or the city as structure or organism. And I was glad you mentioned that, Miguel, because then it becomes something not only to be remade, but to be re-engineered or to be imagined in its biomorphic kind of life form, as a vitalistic life form there. And I thought that was very, very interesting. And I'm sorry Eric's not here, but after he presented, I went on the Sasaki Associates website to look at their plan for Ho Chi Minh City. I highly recommend that you go look at the visualizations of the city that they present for it, because it manifests almost like internal organs, brain, almost like MRI brain scans, the way they're seeing the city in all of their various projections is really interesting, very different from the way he presented it in an ethnographic entity. The other set of ideas that came out of our panel very clearly to me were the ways in which people are really pushing back in very strenuous and highly articulated ways against globalization, whether it's in intimacy, struggling to find intimacy, or their own intimate heritages, the experiential, the sensorium in any way they can, in any sense, or the social, the intersocial, the communal, that there's something that's not manageable about the global city, and people they're struggling to break it down in one way or another. The last thought I'll end with, and this relates to Yota's talk in particular, because I had never thought of the mayor as curator. I really had never thought, but I just think it's a brilliant idea, and it resonates so much with my own work. I work on Tokyo, and particularly on the rebuilding, the response to the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923, and how the city both visualizes, rebuilds, and responds in terms of memory, in terms of its own history, to this incredible natural disaster. And the main impresario of reconstruction is the former mayor of Tokyo, Goto Shinpei. And I had always envisioned him as an urban planner, as high modernist technocrat, as, well, of course, politician par excellence. And I see him almost in the same light as I see Corbusier, because he was trying to do the same thing, but he was really curating modern life. And again, I'm sorry Jordan's not here, because it was Seikatsu that he was trying to preserve but modernize, and this idea of daily life for the well-being of the citizenry. He really was trying to integrate this very high modernist technocratic vision with green spaces and everything that he had even tried to do. So the earthquake provided that opportunity for him. It was kind of ironic. So I don't know, Tokyo 23, Medellin 2015, I don't know, but I think there's a lot to be said about that, to go back and look at mayors as curators. So thank you so much for that.
Okay, I know we're bleary. So I'm just going to sort of think about the panel, the infrastructure panel from this morning, a little bit thematically. And we covered 3 different infrastructures: transport, housing, and waste. And as Miriam said, they were all outside of the West, but clearly, obviously, located in global circuits in important ways. So I'm just going to pull out what I see as 4 themes. One of them had to do with provisioning and sustainability. And so, you know, again, one of the things about the post-socialist, post-Cold War, post-Fordist and neoliberal period is that, you know, the question of whether or not states are even aspiring to provision for their peoples or should provision for their peoples is obviously debated. The question of the role of the private sector in provisioning, and then the question of how people are just going to provision for themselves, like, you know, trash entrepreneurs or whatever. And so and connected with that provisioning and sustainability is the visions for that and the aspirations or assumptions about how provisioning should happen, and I think very much assumptions about whether or not it's sustainable, which, you know, she's looked at, like, her paper, you know, it's like sort of, sometimes it seems automatic if we, you know, that it will be sustainable without thinking through that. A second theme is, I'm going to open up from, Nancy, you just mentioned, and Miguel, I think earlier, ideas that have been raised, open up the idea of the appropriation and extraction that's clearly taking place, but in a way to recast that and thinking about processes of transformation and conversion. Mm-hmm. And in my panel, I think, so it's really interesting how land becomes the money that pays for the infrastructure, which then increases the value of land, which then pays for more infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And so I thought we could recast Marx of, like, LMIL and, you know, do it that way. The conversion of waste into these other values, yeah. And also at a sort of more ethical level and a more sort of affective level, the conversion of revolutionary energies or potential revolutionary and energies of resistance and things like that into more appeasing managed systems as well. So relatedly, the third theme that I sort of can see and talk about is the idea of planning, and 2 of our papers were quite explicitly on planning, and Brenda raised it in the beginning. Because obviously in the planning, the vision and the design, sometimes aesthetic, but other times really is critical. And like when you hear about China, you're sort of like, God, they're efficacious, you know, because, like, one of the things we always think about is unintended consequences or failures or whatever. Now, Robin yesterday had this whole interesting talk about a kind of failed sort of system, but because I mean, a lot of the planning and vision is sort of this idea of if you build it, it will come. If you build it, it'll be sustainable. Right. If you build it, it will modernize us. And the talk today made it sound like when China sets its mind, it will happen. But but the unintended consequences, which I think very much sort of Brenda outlined, and I'm sure exists there I'm sure it exists in the cities and the region and the Istanbul and the planning that you talked about, and particularly then in what sites become sites for political activism, political protest is interesting. And the fourth very abstract sort of theme that I think ties in across a lot is value. And there's the obvious value of money, but then other values come up of use value, and thinking about the building of housings was not primarily in a sense of like of their equity, but of actually use value of the house. The mix between the differentiation between the use and exchange value of some of the trash and things like land, and the use and the use value of farmers who aren't really happy to like have their land appropriated to build sort of these subway things like that. And so just those 4, provisioning and sustainability, the idea of transformation and conversion, planning, vision, and design, and then the question of value were four of the themes that I saw coming from our panel, but that also resonated more broadly with this question of global cities as we've sort of heard it.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to call on Nazara Sayed from the floor to make a few comments.
Well, in the first place, I want to thank the organizer, and I want to thank you, Miriam, for this opportunity. I very much enjoyed the conference and learned quite a lot, heard some very good talks from scholars whom I didn't meet before. Yeah, I'm very grateful. This conference was actually titled Rethinking Global Cities. And I used a few of the questions that were actually posed to the participants in my keynote address. I even had a slide. I make a slide to make sure that it's there. My feeling is that, in a sense, when one thinks about it, we've done quite a lot of rethinking and about quite a lot of cities. But if I had just simply seen the call for papers as well as the title of this conference, and because of my familiarity with the global city discourse, I would have expected that this is going to be a discussion of London, New York, and Tokyo, period. So this puts me in a position where I have to ask, are all of the cities that were presented in this conference, in fact 14 of them to be specific, only 4 of whom used the title, used global in their title, and none of whom actually invoked the globalization discourse. So are all of these cities simply aspiring to be global because global is the thing that everybody wants? When the term was invented, it was certainly invented not necessarily as a utopian idea, but rather as a concept that described how interactions that were going on in the world, financial, social, economic, so on and so forth, are creating very specific hubs that are creating a degree of inequality between cities. And where very specific entities, urban entities within those cities, and here I'm actually invoking my own field as a planner or someone who does urban studies, because I think that the term global and globalization has fundamentally different meanings in the different disciplines. It is something we didn't really talk about quite a bit. So in a sense, when I think about how is it that the global was supposed to be liberatory, emancipatory, it was supposed to allow the opportunity for many to participate. And that hasn't happened. To the contrary, in fact, what has happened is inequality within the global cities has increased, inequality between cities that are categorized as global and others that are not has also increased. So in a sense, I don't know if global was necessary as part of the discourse in this conference. Yet at the same time, and this is a term that some of you use, it's a term that I use in some of my own work, are we living in a post-global moment? Have we come to accept the fact that globalization and the discourse on globalization has outlived its purpose? And by this, I specifically mean this notion that as neoliberalism was coupled with globalization, and as the idea of liberal democracy, and particularly, Fukuyama's idea of the end of history, so on and so forth, which 9/11 put a complete end to. That's it. Liberal democracy is not the panacea that everybody aspires to. In fact, it has failed. It has failed in many parts of the world, and we see that with all of the uprisings that are going on. So maybe we need a different definition of globalization that recognizes all these failures, and that, in a sense, allows us to engage in a debate that is much more constructive in terms of what is it that we want for the future. Now, having said that, I still recognize that there will be fundamental differences between us on disciplinary grounds. And I say that because both Saskia and Manuel, with whom I've had different associations, Saskia Sasson and Manuel Castells, their definitions of the global city, and they were the first to actually advocate the global city as we know it today, was more an interest in how is it that these cities have come to accumulate a considerable amount of wealth, considerable amount of knowledge, considerable amount of information, that they control the world. That it's the interaction between them that literally results in the current economic situation, if you will, in the world. So, where do we put Khartoum? Where do we put Abidjan? Where do we put even Shenzhen? We heard the presentation today, which invoked Shenzhen. I spent a month in Shenzhen. Was an amazing city. As far as I'm concerned, it's a global city. But my global is It's a city that provides for certain amenities that I will find only in 7 or 8 cities in the world. That is my definition of the global, as a result of being a global traveler, if you will. It's a city that provides for many of its citizens certain qualities, but at the same time leaves others behind. Absolutely. Well, but that happens in all cities too. So in a sense, maybe we ought to move beyond the discussion of the global and focus more on the kind of interactions that exist between different classes within a city as they are influenced by global currents. I think this would be a much more productive direction and one that would likely yield a different kind of discussion altogether.
Thank you.
So when we were discussing this as a collective at one point in the preparatory meetings to put this multidisciplinary project, because basically it's a multidisciplinary project that comes from Middle Eastern studies, people that work in literature, and then some of us in art, some others in cultural anthropology. Duke, we don't have architecture, we don't have urban planning, we don't have geography, we don't have. So what are we doing? The School of Engineering. They are dealing with something. We cannot interact with them. When we're putting this together, we had something clear: is that we are our point of origination is a very different point. We don't have people of economy here. Those are the ones doing, the discourse of globalization top down. Globalization is basically an economic model that has, somehow created a network of capital, but not of peoples, right? But people have been somehow affected by those, but the mobility of capital and
well, I'll tell you where I think you've succeeded.
And then was how to include those, and I agree with you, could be more like currents of globalization or something like that, right? More than rethinking.
No, but you succeeded in bringing area studies together in a manner that I have not seen.
Yeah, that's something that we have.
The Ford Foundation 25 years ago had a beautiful initiative called Crossing Borders, from which I managed to get like a $50,000 grant.
As did we.
And it's very interesting because the borders were not crossed. And that was 20 years ago. So in a sense, I think that what you've managed to do here today, the past 2 days, is very much that. It was refreshing to see people who come from European studies, Middle Eastern studies, and Asian studies talk to each other, and talk to each other about a very specific urban entity, and using cities that are not necessarily the ones that everybody pulls out of their hat. So, I think that this was very refreshing.
I have a question. How do you give up the notion of globalization, which I think is becoming almost meaningless because it's used in so many ways and so ubiquitous? But how do you do that? I still find it useful to keep people from falling back into a national discourse. How do you, it's a form of thinking post-nationally, I think. And also, thinking that a local economy or a national economy, that you can resolve any kind of problem in those terms.
I made a distinction between the discourse about the global city and the discourse about globalization. They're not the same for me. Yeah. Globalization is all-encompassing. Globalization has very specific traits that you can see throughout the world. When you draw these maps, you can see that. The global city discourse is very different because it's exclusionary in a sense. And I have to say,
in what sense? In my
well, it's ranked. There's a ranking of what you actually.
It's which cities choreograph globalization.
Right.
You talk about mayors curating things. What mayors aspire to is to have the city increase in rank.
The good things about them, they create these ranks and they are these annual prizes. But who is determining those? Right? We have the Citibank Group, the Wall Street Journal, the Institute for Land Development, who are ranking annually 200 cities that are part of this whatever move, and giving and recognizing one of those every year.
I have one thing I have to throw in really quickly. Does this discourse of the global city include the view of the global city from those who have been excluded. It seems
Right.
to me that you don't have, this
Yeah.
is what the novel does. I mean,
Yeah.
this is what
Actually, that's
it
what
seems
everything
to
does,
me so many of these papers did. So you don't have a discourse unless you have that other side. All right, that's all I wanted to say.
But it's not even just exclusion, it's actually part of the mentality of cities in a global age, is
Right.
those categories. So it's not just, am I a global city or in that ranking, but the ways in which those kind of cultural flows do have satellites and do produce things in relation to the discourse, whether it's even in the understanding of space in call centers or anything related to that, because there's something about these cities are interconnected in ways that is not simply just capital and economics and even geospatial. So I think that's what, I guess that's the way we were really trying to rethink.
Can I go?
When Ranjani mentioned
Yeah.
the emergence of a global language in call centers,
Mhm.
for me, this was really amazing.
Yeah.
Because what is a global language in a call center? But clearly, one is emerging, and it is emerging because of the fact that, well, you know, if you speak a southern accent and you're talking to someone in Massachusetts, he's not going to like it. He's not going to like it.
Right.
So you might as well speak this global language. I would like to know what are the things that define this global language, because it will be one arena.
The email, the e-language that was inserted in the dramas you talked about, I think is very, and the use of really crude Anglo-Saxon terms with asterisks. I mean, so that they, you know, fuck has come to mean F asterisk asterisk asterisk. I mean, you know, you might as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, so, I mean, in the, you're right in this interdisciplinary context, because in the fields I come from, to talk about the analytics, we would say transnational, which, and actually that isn't universal, because I know in Europe and Latin America, that can have, or in certain places it can be so associated with a transnational corporation that you might as well be saying globalization. And in America, in sort of critical, at least American analysis, we don't like the term international because we think of, you know, that still resides on the nation state and whatever. But so my fields are, in anthropology, women's studies, those fields, we use transnational as the analytic. Globalization is a mix of the sort of neoliberal agenda combined with these processes and things like that. But so, I mean, I think that a slightly understated predicate of this, of the conference was the provincializing Europe, the decentering of it. Brenda did invoke Sasson in the opening of her talk, and I think that, and affectionately, but there's many, you know, there are criticisms of her, some of which is just the, like, what about my city? But on one hand, and I think that one of the things about Sasson is that she allows, you know, both Sasson and to a certain extent Castells, I think one of the things they do, and why many of us who don't work in major choreographing cities, although Shanghai and Tokyo have to be seen as those, but is that she, you know, she insists that these whiz global processes are localized, and that the cleaning woman and that immigration and whatever matters, and so she, I think, opens up a methodological lens that can help see, you know, like, you know, if Charlie Pio's trash is going to China, and, you know, or to help see these circuits. And I don't think that it denies the fact that certain cities, certain urban, not even cities, you're right, certain niches, the economic niches in a finite number of cities choreographs the bulk of the world's economy, and we could map out certain disproportionate political senses and whatever as well. But the idea is that some of it is about seeing some particular sites as particularly created transnationally and operating transnationally. We're not used to thinking about Africa necessarily in transnational because, of course, Africa's one country. And so it's all one country. So the idea that your garment site is transnational takes, you know, except Cairo, right? Yeah. Maybe the Maghreb, I don't know. But anyway, right. So I think, I mean, some of this is about the disciplinary differences, but I understood this thing, again, provincializing Europe and bringing this other kind of global cast about some of it about bottom up, but some of it about the circuits that are building these cities. So it's not global. I mean, it's true. I don't think we're talking about global cities as the architect of the global economy. But we are saying that these cities are part of these global circuits and part of this transnational and play a role that gets underemphasized if you're not emphasizing the cleaning women, but you're emphasizing the investment bankers. So that's some of my sense of the logic of it. But yes, I don't think I don't think we can claim that TIMA is like choreographing, you know, major stock market events around the world.
I just want to pick up quickly on the term provincializing Europe. I think we did a really good job from within. the Vienna panel was all about provincial Europe as
I
Europe
noticed that.
writ
That was
large.
great.
It was perfect.
Ironically, it's the only panel in which both papers had global impact.
But they were aspirational.
Right, right.
You know.
No, nostalgic.
Okay, nostalgia combined with
Yeah.
aspirational. Okay.
Sorry, let's have
Right.
a couple of comments. Yeah.
A brief remark, two terms come to mind. They probably won't last the test of time, but mondialization and
Yeah.
planetary but also
The World Social Forum.
cosmopolitanism has been around for a long time, but it sort of comes back into currency. So those are perhaps other.
Very. Jose.
For me, the idea of globalization is something, as you sort of pointed out, when you were trying to maybe say, when you were trying to talk about post-global city, it's in a way an idea of standardization. You know, when you were talking about this type of hotel, really busy public cities.
Oh, yeah.
So it's talking about this stagnation of these large urban centers into becoming homogenized places. I think what the gathering here, in a way, shows is what we're more interested in the new post-globalization era are these places that are not trying to be London,
Right.
LA, New York, but actually where urbanization is happening at paces and in different ways than those urban centers. And that it, as such, is creating more interesting kind of interactions. Even if it's through the recycling of garbage, you know, when you think about Lagos or the scale of different cities that happen in all places. And I think that's what is more interesting about these post-global cities. And I think that's sort of what the different elements of this gathering was interaction.
So we got the wrong name for the conference. You should have just said post-global cities. Any more comments? Well, I'd like to thank you all for your participation and bon voyage wherever you're going.